We're now in a position to apply Kate 80 to the problems of gender in media industries that we started with. So we know that when we started the lecture, we began with a deeply practical problem, and that is the relative absence of women in creative industries, globally speaking, as noted by the Gina Davis Institute. So we've got two problems here. Firstly, why is it that global media industries don't feature any kind of gender equality? But the second problem is, but what would solve that problem? And if we had more gender equality in media industries, would that increase the diversity of media representations? Because doubts have been raised that just simply putting more women in media industries actually would solve problems of representation. And in the examples of Atwar Budget and also Kate 80, we've seen particular answers to that question. And what we've seen really is that the impact that better gender representation in media industries achieves depends greatly on not just the fact of having women in media industries, but depends on the sorts of women who are recruited under particular kinds of circumstances. So, one of the things that we see is that if we study both figures, their emergence in media reflects social changes. Um, Firstly, when we were talking about Iraqi journalists, we were talking about the fact that there is a whole new generation of Iraqi women journalists, not because Iraqi women magically became more creative overnight, but because a whole set of circumstances made journalism a viable vocation for Iraqi women, not for entirely good reasons, in a way that vocation hadn't been available to them before. And the conditions under which that vocation was offered to them had a significant impact on how they practiced it. And we can see the same with Kate 80, that Kate 80 was able to write different news stories where her gender was a factor. When she talks about her coverage of Libya, she talks about in her field notes the fact that she was very conscious that war reporting is normally told with a male voice, with reference to male experts, and that there really needed to be another voice present in order to paint a more complex picture of war. But she came to that conclusion not by virtue of her gender, but by virtue of her particular experience of gender. An experience of gender that very much also was affected by social class and poverty. And these are really the things that shaped her worldview, as was her ability to manage and cope with the ingrained gender imbalances in 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 war corresponding in particular. So, in a sense, we can say that someone like Kate 80 was successful as a journalist because she was able to, I suppose, put forward what you would call a particular type of professional persona, which was a performance that combined issues of race and class, excuse me, of gender and class. So, what we have in the case of Kate 80 is the way that war reporting, the practice of war reporting, changed by virtue of changing industrial and social circumstances and the persona of a particular journalist that allowed for a particular kind of gendered perspective into the telling of war stories, and one in which it's really kind of not particularly practical to try and separate the practice of war reporting from the persona and social identity of the people who practice it. So, what we're talking about is the way that structured identity factors have an impact on how media people do their job. And this is not something which is peculiar to Kate Adie or the topic of gender. One of my other, this is arguably my favorite media studies book of all time. And it's a history, it's not really a media studies, but this is a book called Through Soviet Jewish Eyes by David Schneer. And what this book explains is how it is that the first journalists to break the story of the Holocaust were Soviet combat photographers who happened to be, for the most part, Jewish. And it's a fascinating story of how photojournalism was shaped as a profession in the Soviet Union, mostly by young Jewish men. And it fascinatingly explains how the power of a group of young Jewish men was perversely built on over half a century of anti Semitic prejudice, first under the Tsarist and then under the Soviet regimes, which paradoxically created space for young Jewish men in the photography profession. And it's a fascinating story, again, of how particular kinds of social histories and social identities had a significant impact on a particular media profession. This was war photography or photojournalism as a distinct profession apart from other forms of journalism. So in a very direct way, we can see that photojournalism was directed in a particular direction from the perspective of a generation of Soviet Jewish photographers who were driven toward the profession, not by individual creative desires, but also a set of historical and structural factors. So again, we have this idea of explaining media industries and the relative presence of an absence of other figures from those industries in relation to social factors, and also an illustration of approaching media industries and approaching the practical problems of media industries. For example, the lack of gender equality in media industries is really something that can't be done without referencing social, economic, and historical factors, because the explanations for why people are either present or absent in those professions is very often to be found in those spheres, not within the sphere of professional practice itself. So the lesson is that a powerful way of doing industrial research is to find key figures or key groups of people who suddenly appear within media industries doing their work in a particular way and trying to relate that story to the intersection of professional practices with social history.